welcome back, guys. I'm Tom Blackby, your essential drummer, and welcome to episode 6. That's right, people. It's episode 6. We're doing a good run and all that for these episodes. So, in this episode, I want to talk about the UNT Jazz Workshop shop that I went to. So, if you don't know where UNT is, it's in Denton. It's in Texas. So, it's actually part of the Golden Triangle, which is you got Fort Worth, you got Dallas, and you got Denton on the top. So it's part of Golden Triangle. And a little fun fact, UNT is actually one of the first places that has implemented a jazz studies program. And that was back in the day. And so it's flourished. It's one of the best over there in Texas. And like it was one of the first ones. And some of the founding fathers of the jazz pedagogy is over there. Like a lot of great stuff has happened. So the reason because of that is because if you think about it, jazz was pop music back in the day. And so they decided to do that program because they wanted to educate some of the musicians to be able to have knowledge of jazz so they can preserve the history of jazz. So it was during that time. And so now it's very successful. It's like one of the number one programs out there for jazz studies. And and I'm very grateful that they have the UNT Jazz Workshop. And it kind of felt like a camp to me sometimes, but I'll explain later. But I'm very grateful I actually went, I think it was 2016. I went to the UNT Jazz Workshop. And so when... for me, it took me 5 hours to get to Denton for this workshop. So they usually have this workshop during when it's the Vans Warped Tour, which was like around July or June. So I got to attend this workshop, and I learned a great deal over there. So what was at this workshop? And so what was in the workshop was it consisted of jazz theory, jazz history, combo, and masterclass and a concert towards the end. So it was pretty much every day it was like that. So in that order. So we pretty much, we had, placements for everything. So, not the history, but, we had placement for, the jazz improvisation, like the theory of it. We had a placement for like which combo we should be in, but we didn't have a placement for the history or masterclass because everyone they have so many students, and so they just want to see what the students know, and so they just did that willy-nilly a little bit, but in a professional way, professional willy-nilly, and so I learned a great deal from not just the combos I learned pretty good deal amounts, like how to function in a jazz combo, in different ways to do, function in the jazz combo. We also, the master classes was the biggest thing when I was over there. So in the master classes, this was during a time when Ed Self was actually still working over at UNT. Teaching at UNT, not just working, but teaching at UNT. So he was still there. He hasn't retired yet, and it was like a year later he actually retired. And so my drum teachers were like pushing me, you got to go to the workshop and all that before the guy retires. So I actually did that. So I got to meet with him. I actually did have private lessons before. And then when it was the workshop, I got to see him again. So that was pretty cool that of the workshops. So in the workshops, we got Ed Self. There was also Mike Drake. He was like an adjunct, I think he was an adjunct drum teacher over there, but he also performed at like some sound library place where they read sheet music, and it's just like a place for film places to go to collect music, buy music over there for their commercial use. And then there was Josue Aponte, who's really good in the Latin side of things. And he also did the Latin jazz band over there. So that was really cool that all these faculty members got to do this workshop. So one day it was like Ed Soph, the other days it was other people as well. So Mike Drake had a day, Soy Ponte had another day, and I think Ed Soph did another day too. So they just took turns. So now, why I felt like it was a camp and all that, because pretty much everybody that was over there, except for me and another guy, but pretty much majority of the people were high schoolers. I was like, oh my gosh, like why am I the only college student over here? Which I wasn't, but I kind of felt like that. I felt so out of place. So let's get to the meat of this. So I'm pretty sure you won't care too much about the history or the jazz improv, but the history, there's a great example I do want to mention that was really cool. And with the history, they actually talked about like some drum stuff. They talked about different instruments, like just a little bit of jazz history through the recordings. And so the guy was pretty cool. He said, like, if you're under 30, call me this. And if you're over 30, call me Bob. And so literally his name was Bob. So there was one example of his teaching. He was talking about like some of these drum battles, which was really cool, like trading drum battles. So that's pretty cool to listen to, so you get more vocabulary. But also Charlie Parker. So Charlie Parker was like one of these revolutionary improvisation, just improvisationists. So there was one tune, I can't remember what it was called, but it was when he was playing with the orchestra. Like a string orchestra, and he was soloing, and it was he didn't know the form too well, and so he just, when it came to his solo, he just said boop, and he just listened to the form. He didn't play anything for that first chorus, and then when it came to the second chorus, he knew the changes. Like, he just listened to the changes the first time, and then he knows the changes now. So that's one thing I want to mention, because I actually implemented that to my my trading fours when I'm in a jazz gig. And so when someone's playing and all that, I'll be like, bop. And so some people like that, some people don't. And I always would encourage you to tell your musicians that, hey, on one of the if we do trade fours, there might be a chance that I might just play one note, and you just have to listen to the space. And so it's always good to mention that, because sometimes the musicians are like, please don't do that. Or some of them are like, oh my gosh, oh, that was pretty epic and all. So I did one time, and they mentioned that when I was at Texas State. So, but it's not a bad thing. It's a cool thing I learned. So anyway, with the masterclass, so I learned a great deal from Ed Soph and some of the other faculty members. And so they had a bunch of pamphlets. And it was just that, but also there was some other clinics that happened. Like there was like a sight reading clinic from Mike Stenell, and I think I'll talk about like what I learned in sight reading, and how I can help you with the sight reading stuff, how to be a better sight reader, because that's going to be very important in the future, especially you drummers. You might have to read something, and you have to know how to read it on the sight. On the spot. So I just want to mention that. That is the one thing I'll probably do in a future episode, is sight reading and how to help your sight reading. And so there might be some things you never considered. So anyway, I said I'll get to the masterclass, and now I am. So he had a pretty cool thing about just some things to consider and all that. So he talks about listening, watching, feeling. He talks about a lot of really deep stuff like stick technique. He talks about like how the cymbal is your voice. He talks about stroke systems, and he has like his own exercises that he does. And even though like I hear these stories about Ed Soph and all that, to where that he actually did use books, but nowadays if you talk to him, he say doesn't do that book. Then like it's just like conflicting information, so I have no clue what's true and all that, because I do believe that he did listen to recordings back in his time and all that, and he really used too much books, because he also talks about in a clinic where it's like you're using the Jim Chaplin All-American Drummer. It was the Jim Chaplin book, and he was saying like you wouldn't like play example like 55 or 1A on a gig, right? Like no one's going to say, hey, play that exercise from Jim Chamberlain and all that. No, you don't do that. So that's some things he talks about. It's like, don't be a book boy, don't just rely on exercises, listen to recordings, because that's going to be where most of the material is going to be. And so that's pretty much how people make books and all that. They pretty much listen to recordings. They're like, you know what, this might be good material to have in a book. So I want to mention something about his musical practice type of stuff. He talks about like some of these common things that happen. So it's really important to have time consistency and like dynamic control, tempo form, and like all these things that are like just very elemental and important. And it's like very basic type of stuff. So, and I have this packet, and every time I look at it, I learn something new. And he talks about this packet to where it's like, this packet is 4 years worth of material. And I'm still working on it because like you can't perfect everything that someone gives you. So it's really important to know that. It's like, I might have this packet up somewhere, I don't know, but it just depends. So this packet is really cool. There's a lot of great stuff in here. Like it talks about comping solos, historic styles, like just like you get your money's worth out of this packet, guys. Like it's really, really good. And so he also talks about like this really cool thing where melodic drumming. And so I mentioned this in the Phil episode where I talked about the example of Keith Carlock was when he was a student over there. He was a student at UNT. He took the Omni book and he just tried to play the notes on the drums. And so that's what it sort of taught, kind of taught Keith Carlock, but Keith Carlock took it a step further and used the Omni book, which is a written transcription of Charlie Parker's solos. And so we actually, when we did the workshop, everybody took a turn. That is a little bit of a tongue twister. Everybody took a turn and all that. And we did this tune called Doxy. And so it's like da 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 da. And so we played that on the drums. And so we try to incorporate everything on there. So I did my part. So he just gave that as homework, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's time to test my abilities. So I did pretty well, and so I played the notes correctly, but it was a feel, like my time was a little bit inconsistent when I was doing that. And so I learned a great deal. Because there's a master class, I was like, you should always volunteer, Ty, because there's nothing that could go wrong. Like, no one's going to kill you. You're not going to die from embarrassment, so just volunteer. So he talked about a little bit of that stuff. So there was really cool things he was mentioning, and there's still some things he didn't mention in there. But he talked about like some really good educational materials that he would recommend. And he just mentioned like some ideas about like big band drumming, like consistent with the time of dynamics, play the figures, the horn figures, and what they represent. And articulation is very important to where you can figure out, should I do a snare or a bass in this part, or should I do a tom? So there's just a lot of things that Ed Soph has talked about. And I want to go to some of the other things that some of the other people have done, but it's just such a great resource material that Ed Soph gave. And so there's really cool stuff that he has done. So I want to also mention Mike Drake. He talked about his book, which was, what was it called? Oh gosh, I can't remember what his book was called, but just look up Mike Drake. He has 2 books. It was like a volume 1, volume 2, and it's basically Ed Soph complimented on that book, saying it's just all the basic vocabulary that a drummer should need. It's like the ABCs. So he has these rhythms and all that, and he talks about like all these different beats you do and all that, like just essential combinations and like essential figures. It's like dun 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 dun, and then like just different versions. And he has this in his duple book. So I was singing these things in duple. and he has a triplet type of stuff. And so there's a lot of great stuff. It's like basically like the alphabet type of stuff. And so he mentioned basically that type of stuff. Then next was Josue Aponte. So he gave a really big introduction to Latin American drum set styles. So he had this little debate talking about, like, he was on one gig late last night, and so he was thinking that, you know what, this is a good topic to talk about. And so he was mentioning he was on this one gig, and sometimes they give this title of a beat and you don't know how to go about it. And on one of his gigs, he said that there was something written, like, he said, like, do you see sometimes in the real book where it says, like, play a USA beat or play a Latin beat? Latin is such a vague concept, like actually not vague, I meant broad. Like, there's so many different Latin things that are out there. Like, you got maybe USA Latin beats, you got bossa nova, you got Afro-Cuban, you got salsa, you got samba, and mixing, matching these different Latin stuff, like, that can happen. And, like, how are you supposed to know what Latin beats you're supposed to do? And he just, like, gave us tips and tricks, and sometimes you could ask them what do they mean by that, but other times they're like, oh, I don't know, it's just Latin. And sometimes your failsafe is just like, maybe look at the other people's music to see what the beat is, what their rhythms are, and so you get a basic idea of what that is. But sometimes you don't, then best of luck. Like, a failsafe is just maybe a bossa nova or samba. But if push comes to shove, then maybe a Afro-Cuban or a salsa type of thing, because it's a very, very broad topic. And so he pretty much talked about, like, the Mutano patterns. He talked about, like, just different essential things like Brazilian rhythmic and feel elements, where, like, most of the time people get it wrong sometimes. Like, there's like you messed with the feel and all that. It's kind of like a Jay Dilla type of thing where you mess with the feel. And so it's really important to know that, because it messes with the feel. So he talks about, like, some of that stuff. He like plays a little bit. He also is, the way he was doing stuff was a Q&A type of thing. And one day I just asked him, like, what are some, like, cool, like, calypso type of things? He was like, well, there's Andy Narell, and like, just look it up on the internet, and just listen to recordings, and so you'll get a lot of stuff out of it. And which I did. There's a lot of great stuff. And he talks about, like, in his packet, he has a packet too, and he talks about, it's super deep, and it's a little foreign too. Like, they talk about different instruments that, like, if you look up the instruments of the core of, like, maybe samba or bossa nova, then you're going to learn a lot more stuff on the drum set, because you get to the root of the style, and you understand why we play which and what. So if you're doing a bossa nova and all that, why do we play on the hi-hats? To simulate a metal sound and all that, or the bell to simulate a metal sound. Now, why do we play on our snare drum? So we can play it on the actual, like, little snare they have. Okay, why do we use the bass and all that? For the surdo. And there was one funny thing I heard about surdo, which was, if it was translated, I can't remember which language, but it was like deaf. It was translated to deaf, and I was like, wait, what? And all this can't be right. And I haven't looked it up yet, but that might be true. Who knows? You never know. But surdo sounds pretty bad, bad to me. So I learned that from Josue Aponte, and then towards the very last day, Edsoph was talking about common problems that were, like, encountered with small and big bad drumming. So he talked about, like some of his old same stuff, like tempo, dynamics, lack of dynamic range. So I kind of talked about it in my other episode about dynamics. And so the overplaying of accents, like inappropriate sticks, he's very picky about sticks, because if he sees, here's a story that I've heard, that if he sees you with sticks that are so super chipped up, he'll be like, you're not using right technique. You're not. He'll talk about why like your sticks that are like so like kind of like chipped up, and he believes that your sticks should last a long time, like for a really long time. Like I still have drumsticks for like that are like 10 years old, and that's because I don't use them. But imagine that, like where you're playing and you're able to keep your sticks, the life of your sticks, because you should not be breaking your sticks like every time you play. To me, like there's something wrong, and I think he would think that too. So, and he mentions about two drummer syndrome, where it's like you're aggressive when confident, and then you're timid when unsure. And so it's always good to be confident when you're playing. So he also talked about like what are some like the most important things that are out there. Like there's technique, like that's really important. There's reading. There's like understand where the form is. Solos, you should be listening to the sound. The color is important, so we talked about that as well. But there's really nothing too much. So I really learned a great deal from the workshops, and also I learned a great deal from the concerts. So the concerts that they had towards like the very end of the night, and also towards the very end, we actually, all the combos actually got to play. We actually got to play our own stuff. So it was really cool for the faculty concerts. So I got to see Ed Sove, Mike Drake, Josue Plante play, and Josue Plante, oh my gosh, his feel was really cool with the Latin stuff. I was like, I gotta record this, and I gotta like try to replicate his feel. And so after with all the masterclass stuff, I learned that, okay, I should take the feel in consideration and all that. Not consideration, but actually replicate the feel. And some people actually don't do that. They just listen to this stuff. It's like, oh, let me play this. And they just focus on the rhythm. They just focus on the elements, but not the feel. And so this is really important to focus on the feel when you're listening to records, and try to replicate that, because people pay for feel. They don't pay for like, oh, look at my chops and all that. Pretty awesome, man. No, they pay for your feel. If you feel good, they want to keep you. And so that's the biggest thing. And that's a little thing. I think I mentioned that in my piano bar episode, to where it's like you pay for a feel. And they don't pay for like, oh, this guy knows a lot of chops. No, you pay for the groove and feel. So that's what pays the money. Well, that's about it, guys. So I'm Tom Bachman, your social drummer, and I'll see you next time.